You cannot just stand by this right when you agree with them. You cannot just stand up and say this should be protected when you agree with what the company's doing. And that's what makes me maddest about all of this is if Disney was sitting there pushing back on like kids having trans surgeries, the entire discussion we're having right now would be flipped, where you would have Democrats probably trying to strip them of their power and go after them, and you'd have conservatives trying to protect them and speak up for their free speech. And it's Hey guys, welcome back to the Base Politics Podcast. I'm Hannah Cox. This is Brad Polumbo. This week, DeSantis versus Disney, a fight over the debt ceiling and quick hits. Let's jump in. I decidedly do come down on Disney's side in this current fight, and we have to get into it because it has been building for over a year now, and we have to make sure we catch people up. I know we previously talked about some of this on our show, so you can go back and listen to all of our thoughts on the initial legislation that sparked this feud, but we're just going to recap quickly here. So last year, Florida Republicans passed the Parental Rights and Education Act, which came to be more commonly known as the Don't Say Gay bill. That was initially something detractors started calling it, but it's really what it's come to be known as, so we're going to mostly refer to it as that throughout this. DeSantis signed the bill and it drew national backlash. Disney, which is Florida's largest employer and a longtime supporter of LGBTQ rights, spoke out on behalf of its employees in the state at that point. Now, their involvement was a little too late if you asked a lot of people. They were widely criticized by shareholders, their employees, and the Human Rights Campaign that had pledged money to because they really didn't get involved in pushing back.
They kind of managed to piss everyone off. They got the worst of both worlds. Like they didn't say anything, and so the left got really mad at them, and then they did, but it was kind of like it wasn't even a stinging criticism. It was like a lukewarm statement against the bill. And so the right got furious, but also the left still wasn't happy. So whoever, I guess the one person who really deserves a little blame here is maybe Disney's PR folks, because they did not handle this great.
And it was kind of weird because, to be clear, I've worked Florida politics for some time off and on. Number one, Disney gets a ton of corporate welfare. They've always had a very cozy relationship with the state government. They also bring in a ton of money to the state. And so it's a convoluted relationship. But Disney spends a ton of money lobbying in Florida. And I do mean a ton of money lobbying. And so the fact that they didn't really lobby against this bill is what got them so much internal criticism. And then by the time they did speak out, like the ink was all but dry. And even then, it was just sort of a statement pushing back against legislation. And I think the CEO called DeSantis. So it's not like they went on some warpath against this bill, at least not until it was too late. But they did speak out, and DeSantis seems to have a pretty, let's just say a little bit of a glass jaw for criticism. He reacted immediately to the pushback on this, came out and started trashing the company, said that they were woke, and really sort of went hard, and it started to amplify their dispute. So a couple days after those remarks, Disney then announced it would no longer fund campaigns in the state, period. And this is no small deal because Disney donated something like $4.8 million to Florida candidates in the 2020 election cycle alone. During the 2020 election cycle, they gave $913,000 to the Republican Party of Florida and another $586,000 to GOP Senate campaigns. They also donated $313,000 to the Florida Democratic Party and $50,000 directly to DeSantis. Now, this is not uncommon to see companies donate widely across the aisle. They're covering their bets. They want to make sure, again, that when it comes time to lobby for things that they want, Republicans and Democrats and the governor will go along with it. So it's not abnormal to see that, but the fact that they are threatening to pull back that amount of money out of the campaign cycle is a pretty big blow. And that's when the gloves really came off. DeSantis then started pushing for a bill during a special session last year in Florida that would dissolve Disney's Reedy Creek Improvement District, which was reversing not only something that I think is a long-held conservative principle of protecting free speech, even of your political opponents, but also it could have had, or could still have, I guess, really colossal economic impacts in Central Florida. And I think that it's important just to briefly kind of explain what the situation is, because he's tried to label that as corporate welfare, but there's been pushback on whether or not this is corporate welfare, right? This special district that Disney has.
Yeah, so it is definitely a somewhat unique arrangement, the special district, though other companies do have districts and there are others in Florida. It's not completely unique, but it is unusual. It's not enjoyed by most companies in the state. So whether it's really truly corporate welfare, though, I've seen people on either side kind of argue, yes, it is, or no, it isn't. But one interesting perspective came from Sarah Rumpf, a contributing editor for Mediaite. She writes that when Walt Disney was scouting Central Florida for his next theme park in the mid-1960s, neither Orange nor Acela County had the resources or staff to manage the massive development and the creation of RCID. That's the Reedy Creek Improvement District, the Disney district we're talking about. The creation of it was supported by both local and state government officials. The 1967 state statute that created RCID granted the Walt Disney Company broad powers to develop and control the land they purchased to build projects that would eventually include some of the world's top tourist attractions like Magic Kingdom, Epcot, Animal Kingdom, plus Disney hotels, restaurants, and retail stores. It's a 25,000 acre piece of land that's southwest of Orlando. It stretches over Orange and Acela counties. But the tax situation is also implicated here, right?
Mm-hmm. That's right. So this is where I think I mostly side with people who say it's not corporate welfare, because corporate welfare is one of two things. It's either the government giving a company handouts, right, direct cash, or it's giving them special tax breaks that other people don't enjoy. And I think both are wrong, and I'm unilaterally opposed to both kinds of situations. But Disney is very much paying taxes on this. So according to her reporting, Disney collects and remits sales tax to the state, including a small percentage that goes to each county, as well as collecting tourist development taxes from hotel guests. And Disney pays county property taxes, nearly $300 million, in fact, from 2015 to 2020, as well as the RCID levying taxes on Disney's properties to cover needed expenditures for local government type functions like building permitting, fire, emergency medical services, a power plant, water and waste treatment, trash and recycling, and construction and maintenance of roadways and waterways. RCID demands a higher standard than the neighboring counties, interestingly enough, resulting in immaculately maintained roadways. Locals frequently joke about trying to get Disney to seize control of the unending I-4 construction, building codes that are state-of-the-art for hurricane protection, and significant resources devoted to environmental protection. So, as Sarah said, it's not a tax break, it's not corporate welfare, it's actually extra taxes Disney pays, and they provide the services, and they don't ask the counties to do so. And they do it better, it must be pointed out, than any government in the entire state does when it comes to...
But it is a unique arrangement, though. They do have privileges not granted to every company in the state.
Sure. That's true. But I would say I fall on the side of saying this isn't really corporate welfare. It's a special privilege. Right? Yes, I would agree with that. I would not call it corporate welfare. So, I don't think we have to get too into the weeds on that, but I do just think that's so interesting. And I think it's really funny that this is sort of indicative of what we always say, that private companies do a better job at everything the government does, including building permits, including
government,
including the roadways, like all of it. Yeah. So DeSantis was criticized widely for his threats against the company, as it's been pretty clear all along that this is retaliation over the company's protected political speech. And to be pretty clear, I do mean that DeSantis is on record saying that this is retaliation basically over and over and over. It's also worth noting that Florida Republicans who crafted the language to do this, they did it to where it only affects special districts granted before 1968. So it only impacts Disney and a couple of other companies that have these provisions. It still leaves it intact for the vast majority of the companies in the state that have special districts. So if this was some campaign against corporate welfare, some principled stand, you wouldn't have crafted the legislation that way. Let's be serious.
Gotten rid of all of them.
Exactly. So he got really criticized. He held off for a little bit on actually going through with it, but earlier this year he did pull the trigger and move forward with his threats. The governor gave the district a new name. He renamed it the Central Florida Tourism Oversight District, and he appointed 5 of his allies to the board, including a prominent parents' rights activist, a Christian nationalist, and a lawyer who donated $50,000 to his campaign. Now, on paper, the new board would supervise municipal services and development for the land around Disney World, but in practice, DeSantis said the board would also serve as a moral arbiter for a company that had lost its way. And one of the board members told NPR, one of the board members told NPR early March that its first step would be conducting a sweeping financial and legal audit into Disney's behavior. Tell me what you've heard that's more commie fascist in recent memory than that.
Well, I could think of some things, but it's pretty bad. Yeah.
I mean, it's on the right. Like, this is the kind of thing you expect from AOC or Bernie Sanders. This is literally saying, we don't like how a company acts, so we are going to use the government to come in and try to force them to behave in a way that we see as moral. What?
Yeah, the moral arbiter thing is strange. It's
creepy and completely antithetical to everything Republicans claim to believe in when I was growing up. Anyways, we'll move on. So he did all this, but he wasn't quick enough for the mouse. 19 days before DeSantis signed the final bill, the former board signed agreements with Disney, essentially stripping themselves, the board, of power and handing that power back to Disney in a binding declaration that doesn't expire until England's monarchy dies out.
That's a weird detail.
Weird, random detail. And honestly, like, Prince Charles is pretty old, so I don't quite get it. But anyways, that's how they structured it. I'm sure there's legal weeds we get into for why they did it. I'm not that interested, but it is kind of funny. But basically that means the 5 DeSantis allies who pledged to rein in one of Florida's largest employers now lack the ability to do much of anything unless they take legal action. So checkmate government on that move. I thought that was pretty hilarious. And then DeSantis, of course, was completely outraged by this, and he was kind of left fumbling the bag. He followed that up with more threats against the company, including this statement where he jokingly threatened to build a state prison next to the park.
If you look at this whole special district, Walt Disney Corporation obviously owns a lot of it, but the district owns other land. Quite frankly, I wasn't even thinking about that land. We just wanted them to live under the same rules, pay the debt, pay the taxes, all that stuff. Oh, but come to think of it, now people are like, what should we do with this land? People have said maybe create a state park, maybe try to do more amusement parks. Someone even said, like, maybe you need another state prison. Who knows? I mean, I just think that the possibilities are endless, and so that is now going to be analyzed to see what would make the most sense.
So I don't know about you, Brad, but I think the last thing I want to go to is a government-run amusement park. That sounds terrible. But secondarily, even if he was joking, I just thought this was such an insane thing for a governor to even joke about. You're going to put a prison next to a children's amusement park. That's so...
Yeah, I mean, you're not really supposed to... I get that he was probably joking, but even the suggestion that you would use the power of government to troll a massive company and reduce their property values is just like... Right, it's a yikes from me. And it also seems that Disney has had enough, because last week they filed a long overdue First Amendment lawsuit against DeSantis. The Walt Disney Corporation is alleging that he waged a relentless campaign, quote unquote, to weaponize government power against the company and orchestrated at every step a crusade meant to punish Disney for its political views. In their lawsuit, they write, the government action was patently retaliatory, patently anti-business, and patently unconstitutional. Now, I think, so the lawsuit has a couple of claims in it, some of which I don't, for example, like a takings claim and a property claim and some other things that I don't necessarily know whether they're meritorious or not. Also, like them saying it's anti-business doesn't really seem very legally relevant to me. But the key relevance here, in our view, right, is that this was retaliatory for protected First Amendment speech, that it is unconstitutional for a government to punish its citizens or a corporation for their speech by using retaliation, even if it's something they don't actually have a right to. So for me, it's always a good sign that you've got a strong First Amendment case when you've got the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, FIRE, on your side, and they put out a statement, because really no organization, they are the gold star of free speech now. Their statement says, Governor Ron DeSantis' moves to punish Disney for opposing his education policies are unlawful. The Constitution forbids politicians from using the machinery of government to reward those willing to mouth the party line or to retaliate against those who refuse to do so. So when I saw this, and I've had First Amendment concerns all along, but this really kind of nailed it in for me that the strong part of the lawsuit is the First Amendment part. This seems pretty clear cut to me.
Yeah, I think when you get into the takings and anti-business claims, some of that will come down to like, what is the monetary value of the harm that's been caused against Disney? And that's, that'll be sorted out in the courts. I'm not as interested in all of that either. To me, from the very beginning, when they started pushing for this sort of retaliatory action against Disney, I have a number of statements that I can actually point to that would back this up. You have State Representative Spencer Roach saying, if Disney wants to embrace woke ideology, it seems fitting they should be regulated by Orange County. You have Representative Randy Fine, a Republican, saying, you got me on one thing. This bill does target one company. It targets the Walt Disney Company.
Hold up. Talk about saying the quiet part out loud.
Yes, I know. And as David French points out in his article, which we'll get into a bit more in a minute, he says statements from Governor DeSantis and other Republican state officials are remarkably brazen. DeSantis said he thought Disney's mild opposition, which mainly consisted of a public statement and a phone call from the former Disney CEO Bob Chapek to DeSantis, moves that a number of LGBTQ activists considered inadequate, quote, quote, crossed the line, and he promised to, quote, make sure we're fighting back. He also accused Disney of, quote, pledging a frontal assault on a duly enacted law of the state of Florida, as if this law is somehow like untouchable. You can't criticize it. We passed it. How dare you criticize it? What?
You have the right to do that. You have the right to speak out against the law, whether one agrees with the law or not.
Exactly. This is so clearly, and I think this is actually, I want to get into the weeds a bit more, but on its face, that's all that actually matters. You have a Republican legislature and a Republican governor sitting here trying to use the full weight of government to target a company financially and harm them because of protected free speech, right? This is something that should be so ingrained on the right that people should be aghast. And it's important to remember, Citizens United upheld this. Businesses, private business owners, have every much as of a free speech right as you as an individual do. And so them speaking out as a company is First Amendment speech. It is free speech. And you want companies to be able to speak out against things that the government does when they're wrong. You cannot just stand by this right when you agree with them. You cannot just stand up and say this should be protected when you agree with what the company's doing. And that's what makes me maddest about all of this is if Disney was sitting there pushing back on like kids having trans surgeries, the entire discussion we're having right now would be flipped, where you would have Democrats probably trying to strip them of their power and go after them, and you'd have conservatives trying to protect them and speak up for their free speech. And it's just infuriating to me that we're at a point in our society where people cannot see past the end of their own noses and stand up for free speech and stand up for free market capitalism at the end of the day, unless you agree with it. That's not how a society functions. There is no woke exception to the First Amendment. You don't have to like what Disney believes or thinks. What you need to like is the Constitution and free speech. And it's just really a fundamental fight that we're going to have in the GOP of what do you stand for these days? Because it feels like nothing. It feels like you stand for nothing.
Yeah, I agree. But here's the statement that DeSantis's office put out in response to the lawsuit from Disney. This is from Deputy Press Secretary Jeremy Redfern. He says, "We are unaware of any legal right that a company has to operate its own government or maintain special privileges not held by other businesses in the state. This lawsuit is yet another unfortunate example of their," meaning Disney's, "hope to undermine the will of the Florida voters and operate outside the bounds of the law." So what they are, and I've heard them make this argument elsewhere, there's no right to corporate welfare. And let's, for sake of argument, agree that it's corporate welfare. I agree. And so that's why if DeSantis had, based on nothing, decided we need to get rid of all special districts in the state of Florida, and they passed a bill to do it, totally would have been fine. Now, when they decided to do, Disney criticized us, our fifis are hurt, now we're going to punish them, let's go revoke their district. And they pretty openly admit that that's what they're doing. That is retaliatory. And the government is not allowed under the First Amendment to punish people for their speech, to punish citizens for their speech. Even when it comes to revoking benefits, they have no inherent right to. There was actually a pretty famous case about this called O'Hare Truck Service versus the city of Northlake. And in that case, per this New York Times article, the Supreme Court ruled 7-2 that local governments cannot revoke benefits, even privileges businesses have no inherent right to, in retaliation for a company's political opposition. Yet they're really not denying that that's what they're doing.
No, and I pointed to that very Supreme Court case all the way back last year when I first began criticizing DeSantis over this. And I've had some people in the comments, it's just so, I'm sorry, I don't mean to be haughty about this at all, but I've worked around litigation for over a decade now. I'm pretty astute when it comes to constitutional litigation. Try to tell me that this was a limited holding. No, sweeties. This was a Supreme Court decision. That means it applies to the nation at large. And it came down to a very similar issue at stake, where basically in this city, you had a list of towing truck companies that the police department would use. And they kind of go down the list. And to get on that list, who knows what you had to do to get on it. But mostly once you were on it, and you got, called pretty routinely to do the state's business. One of the tow truck owners of these companies spoke out in favor of a political candidate who was running against the local mayor, and that mayor retaliated by having his company taken off that list. And therefore, you got this decision. And I think that is absolutely the right decision. And again, just in case you think this wasn't similar, I want to roll this clip of DeSantis recently talking about his actions.
I just think as conservatives, it's not conservative to just simply defer to every corporation in America. That's being a corporatist. And so when I have to look to see in the state of Florida, are we being governed appropriately? Are we advancing the rule of law? And I have to take on a company like Disney, a corporatist would say that you have to give Disney everything at once. Well, in reality, Disney was enjoying unprecedented privileges and subsidies. They controlled their own government in Central Florida. They were exempt from laws that virtually everybody else had to follow. They had great tax breaks. They were even able to rack up debt. No single entity or individual in the state of Florida enjoyed such privileges. And that's not good government, that's not free enterprise, but it's certainly even worse when a company takes all those privileges that have been bestowed over many, many decades and uses that to wage war on state policy regarding families and children. So we said that arrangement doesn't work for us. That self-governing status is gone. And that's exactly what we did, and we were right to do that. And now, more recently, they tried to do an end run around that to preserve self-governing in defiance of the legislature. And we're now counteracting that. And again, if you're a corporatist, you would not want to counteract that because you would let them do whatever they want. But if you're somebody that believes that we, the people, ultimately govern and that we should have a rule of law and that a free enterprise means actually everybody follows the same set of rules, then what Florida's doing is exactly and precisely correct. And we're going to continue to do what is correct.
So I think you can tell by those statements that he is continuing to quite brazenly admit that this was retaliatory. And I want to be clear that the O'Hare Truck Service case, that's far from the only case that we've seen win a First Amendment retaliation at the Supreme Court. As David French again says in his op-ed, prohibitions against government retaliation for protected speech are as clearly established as virtually any constitutional doctrine in American law. But what O'Hare does show us as clearly as any modern Supreme Court case is the idea that denying government benefits is a form of government control. And when it's done for the express purpose of punishing an exercise of constitutionally protected speech, it violates the Constitution of the United States. And he goes on to say, America's federal, state, and local governments control immense resources. Total government spending is over $9 trillion annually, and those are just direct expenditures. The government also controls the ability to enact tax breaks and other financial incentives for individuals and businesses. And while there are good arguments against governments providing economic inducements and incentives to private corporations, those inducements and incentives cannot then depend on an implied requirement that the corporations agree with the government on matters of public policy. Otherwise, governments could use the power of the purse to create a two-tiered society, granting and withholding government regress on the basis of political agreement. And that gets into the essence of what you see in far left communist countries or in far right fascist countries. You don't want the government having this kind of power. And it really seems so short-sighted that in their rush to try to just own the libs or win the culture war, Republicans are throwing away principles of free market capitalism and limited government and free speech. And it's not going to serve them well.
No, it's not. And just a good parallel here is that New York Attorney General tried to very explicitly go after the NRA and they were investigating it. I don't remember the exact details of this story, but the New York government went after the NRA, and conservatives and Republicans screamed bloody murder. And I was one of them, actually. I was saying this is really wrong. They can't target a private organization like this because they dislike their beliefs. But now they're doing that. You know, I would be curious. I don't know. Maybe I'll Google it after this. If DeSantis made any statements about the NRA thing, he might not have because it's New York, it's not Florida. But if he did, I wonder if those statements aged well. But a lot of Republicans and conservatives and right-wing media really did raise the alarm, and they screamed bloody murder over this. But it's kind of the inverse thing that's happening here.
I mean, you could definitely see a situation where DeSantis would have been like, NRA can move to Florida. We're open for business in Florida. But like, I would actually argue, and we criticize the left very heavily for their increasing opposition to free speech and the culture. But I would say that when you start looking at many of these state legislatures, especially Florida's, which is heavily Republican, they're actually passing more anti-free speech legislation than others in the country. And I think Florida, as I've been watching them for the past couple of years, has become one of the worst states for free speech. You not only have this whole debacle, which I think, you know, I think Disney should win this lawsuit, but it's not certain that they will. And if they don't, this is going to be really detrimental legal precedent. But aside from just this, we've seen Florida pass a completely unconstitutional social media bill trying to tell social media companies and private business owners yet again that they must host political speech. They must host political candidates and politicians on their platforms. That's still tied up in the courts. I would argue the Don't Say Gay bill was pretty anti-free speech in and of itself. At the very least, you could say it was very poorly crafted to where there were a lot of unanswered questions. Teachers were left wondering if they could even mention the fact that they had a same-sex partner, right? And obviously, you know, I think it's fine to tell teachers don't push your ideology in the classroom, don't bring, you know, gender politics into the classroom when you're teaching, but it was written in such a way where it really wasn't clear that it was that specific or that targeted. So I would say that also presented free speech issues within and of itself.
Don't forget the Stop Woke Act, right?
Right.
Another piece of legislation where they were explicitly trying to block even higher education, even college professors from teaching divisive concepts. So I would actually agree with you. I will say I've been a fan of a lot of the things DeSantis has done, particularly his how he handled the COVID pandemic. Yeah. It took real courage to buck Trump and buck Fauci and everyone else and reopen his state. I think Florida has low taxes, low regulation in many ways. It's in many ways a free state, but I do agree with you that on different forms of commercial speech regulation and education regulation, I don't like the direction that it's going.
Mm-hmm. And I want to say I agree with everything you said. I want to apply that more broadly to the Republican Party, because I think in their rush to try to fight the culture war, they are basically doing what Republicans always do, which is sort of creating their own demise in the next decade, because they are, again, going to set legal precedents that they certainly do not want turned on them. They are eroding free speech. They're eroding support for free market capitalism. They are providing their enemies with fodder, right? The more you allow the government to infringe on the market, the worse problems you get. And then people on the left get to say, see, this is a capitalist society. Look how poorly it's going. No, this is a society that is overrun with government in the marketplace. But when we don't have the Republicans actually consistently standing for capitalism and pushing towards it, it makes it really easy to conflate what they're doing with capitalism, and therefore they have to own all the problems that are created by big government that they're allowing to seep into the society more and more and more. And so I really do think if Republicans want to end the culture war, they would exit it, and they would say, live your life as you please, keep the government out of your bedroom, keep the government out of your bank account. There's no market for a politician or party who's going to come out and want to interfere in both. I think that is a losing mentality and ideology. It maybe appeals to some older boomers, but I'm telling you, you want to reach, I hear this from older people all the time. How do we reach the young people? How do we get young people involved in these ideas? One, consistently stand for something of actual merit, which again would be free market capitalism and limited government. And two, stop trying to be busybodies involved in everybody's lives. Nobody's interested in that, or if they are, it's a side of society that's quickly dying off. So I'm really disgusted by this turn on the right. It's why I no longer really consider myself a part of it. I'm kind of over here in my own independent camp, but I think it spells a long-term demise for these groups of people if they don't get their act together.
Hey guys, Hannah here. I want to take a second to tell you about a really cool upcoming event. Celebrate liberty in style while connecting with changemakers from across the country. America's Future, the organization that's empowering the next generation of freedom's leaders, is excited to announce its most glamorous gala yet. Join them on Thursday, May 25th at the historic Anderson House, located in DuPont Circle of Washington, D.C. Known as one of D.C.'s most fashionable mansions, it serves as the perfect backdrop for you to walk the red carpet, enjoy the open bar, take in the artwork, and kick off your shoes to tear up the dance floor. Don't miss your chance to clink glasses with inspirational young leaders from across the country. Get your tickets today at americasfuture.org.
All right, let's move on and talk about the debt ceiling, because there's some big drama going on in Congress right now about whether the federal government is going to be able to pay its bills. Because Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen is warning Congress, she just sent a letter to Congress, unless Congress votes to raise the debt ceiling, which is a currently legislated cap on how much debt the government can take out. Unless Congress votes to raise the debt ceiling, raise that cap on how much debt they're able to take out, by early June and possibly June 1st, that is their best estimate that they won't be able to pay their bills. And so that would cause the U.S. to go into default on the debt when you can't pay all your bills. Because right now they're using like emergency cash measures to pay the bills. And so they don't know exactly when it will run out, but she's estimating early June, possibly as soon as June 1st. So they have about a month to get their act together, because basically everyone agrees the U.S. cannot be allowed to default on its debt. That would cause a massive recession. The economy would suffer. Tons of people would be laid off. The stock market would crash. It would be a complete disaster. And also it would be wrong. Like, we borrowed money, we have to pay it back. And we've spent money, we have to pay for it. Raising the debt ceiling isn't about the future so much as it is paying for the spending that Congress has already passed. But this has led to a standoff because we have divided government right now. You have Biden and the Democrats just want a clean renewal to raise the debt limit. Just pass a bill that has no reforms, no change, just increases the limit on the credit card. Republicans are like, hang on, we're not going to do that without addressing the problem, at least somewhat. So they want to pursue a series of reforms. Take a listen to what Biden has had to say on this subject.
The most immediate thing we can do is ensure the continued reliance of our economy and the financial system. The most important thing we have to do in that regard is to make sure the threat by the Speaker of the House to default on the national debt is off the table. For over 200 years, America has never, ever, ever failed to pay its debt. To put in the capital and colloquial terms, America is not a deadbeat nation. We have never, ever failed to meet the debt. And as a result, we're one of the most respected nations of the world. We pay our bills, and we should do so without reckless hostage-taking from some of the mega Republicans in Congress.
So I love that he says America's not a deadbeat nation. I don't often think he's very funny in his speeches, but that was pretty hilarious to me. And I would like to think that's true, but we're behaving like a deadbeat nation because we are spending so much more than we could possibly even raise through new taxes. This is utterly insane. And I've been reading this book. Sorry to be a bit off topic. I've been reading this book called The Making of a President, 1964, and it details a lot of things around JFK and his assassination and just leading into LBJ. But in that book, they're talking about how we first got away from a balanced budget. And I just cannot help but think about that. We're not even having a conversation around a balanced budget anymore. We're not even having a real conversation about how do we adequately plan for our future. It just feels like the train is totally coming off the tracks. And it's pretty terrifying to me as, a mid-30-year-old about what our future is going to look like. On top of that, I feel like I'm pretty sure Republicans did pass something to raise the debt ceiling, if I'm not mistaken. So it's not like they are just these people holding the purse strings and actually acting like the adults in the room either, right?
Well, that's the thing is they actually are. So it's false of him to claim that they're holding us hostage or they're going to make us default, because Republicans have literally already passed legislation that would raise the debt limit, which is the responsible thing to do. But they've included spending cuts in it. And that's why Biden's not okay with it. He wants, because we have to raise the debt limit, but he wants it done with no changes or reforms. Republicans have passed a raise of the debt limit, but they've included some cuts and some reforms, and that's unacceptable to him. So he's saying that they're holding us hostage or going to make us default when they've literally already passed legislation. All they have to do is pass it through the Senate, in which Democrats control, and the president has to sign it, and boom, this problem's fixed. However, he's unwilling to accept it because of the details of the Republican legislation, which, as you'll see, are actually not even that radical. They're extremely milquetoast. But so this is from NBC News. The Republican-controlled House voted Wednesday to pass a bill to raise the debt limit, slash spending, and roll back key pieces of President Joe Biden's agenda after a series of concessions overnight to win over stubborn GOP holdouts. McCarthy's bill, dubbed the Limit, Save, Grow Act, would lift the federal borrowing limit by $1.5 trillion, or through March 31st, whichever comes first. It would cut federal discretionary spending to fiscal 2022 levels and impose a 1% growth cap. It also would recapture unspent COVID relief funds, kill Biden's student debt cancellation plan, based, rescind IRS enforcement funding, based, and add new work requirements for able-bodied adult recipients of federal programs like Medicaid, also based. But so the interesting thing is, this is not some hardcore balanced budget bill that Biden would have to. It just cuts spending a little bit to 2022 levels.
That's what I was going to say. It basically just goes back to 2022, it sounds like.
Which is, you know this, but 22 levels are quite high.
Are crazy. Are still absolutely off the rocker.
So the Republican legislation is actually not very extreme. And if anything, it doesn't go far enough to balance our actual budget and cut the debt. Because as the Dispatch reports, the Congressional Budget Office estimates the full plan would lower federal borrowing over 10 years by $4.8 trillion compared to the baseline. So we would have, over the next 10 years, we would still add a lot of debt, but it would be about $5 trillion less debt than the baseline. However, the government, again, per the Dispatch, the government would still borrow $15.5 trillion over the next decade and run an annual deficit in 2033 of nearly $2.2 trillion, or 5.6% of GDP. For context, the average deficit from 1970 to 2008 was 2.4% of GDP. So basically, this would shave off a sizable amount, but we'd still add a crap ton of debt and be at debt levels way above our historical averages. And yet they're acting, if you see the Democrats on Twitter and Biden and everything, they're acting like draconian Republicans want to slash Meals on Wheels and cut veterans benefits and cut the military and all this stuff. And it's like, dude, it's literally 2022 levels. They do this very misleading thing where they compare it all to baselines, so that if you keep funding the same, they call it a cut. Right. And that's some of what's going on here. But more broadly, like, I think the Republican bill is a lot better than a blind just reauthorization of the debt limit. But if anything, it clearly doesn't go far enough to actually solve these problems. I get that they have to be practical about what they can actually pass, but it doesn't go far enough on the merit.
This is what I was saying earlier, though. I understand you have to be pragmatic. I understand that if we default, it's very, very bad. But they are literally nothing but, as F.A. Hayek described, the brakes on the train of progressivism at this point. There is no alternate plan. There is no other track that they're going to get us on. There is no going back to a balanced budget with these people even. This is dire. How bad does it have to get monetarily in this country until people wake up? And I think it comes down to complete financial illiteracy amongst the American people, where they truly do not understand that the reason they are getting poorer day by day, the reason they cannot keep savings in their accounts, the reasons they can't afford to buy a house, the reasons they don't know when they'll get to retire, this is because of government spending. That is what it all traces back to. That is why we keep printing new dollars. That is why interest rates have to get hiked. Until you understand how these things fit together and how it actually does impact you on the day-to-day, your life will continue to get worse. And what absolutely blows my mind is that there is a significant portion of this country that wants to spend a ton more spending than even this, right? They want us to have universal health care. They want to wipe out all student debt. They want to not have to pay their rent. I mean, on it goes. There is no end in sight for the things that they want the government to pay for. And they live in a fantasy land where they literally think that you can somehow get billionaires who already pay almost 50% of all federal taxes to cover not only the existing debt and spending, but to take it even further and pretty much double it in many capacities. So I'm just so fed up because it does personally impact you and I. And I don't even think that the adults are in the room and the Republican groups either. I mean, again, you don't see most Republicans even wanting to like cut Social Security or reform Medicaid and Medicare. They don't even want to do the basic day-to-day decision making that we need to see lawmakers rise up to do if we're going to have a sustainable future and economy. And good God, I mean, I'm scared enough for my own future. I can't imagine having kids into this. Like, are you guys not terrified for your kids and grandkids? Because you should be.
Yeah, I mean, I would be definitely concerned. I tend to think that stuff like this, eventually it will blow up, right? Eventually we will default, or we will, the interest payments will balloon so much on the debt that it'll cause a financial crisis of some sort. And that's the thing. Unfortunately, in America, like our politicians, they'll never get enough public pressure to do something until it's too late. Kind of, I mean, that's how I think they'll respond to this. But look, keep an eye out. This story will continue to play out over the next month until June 1st. But don't buy any spin from Democrats that like their Republicans are going to force us to default, because they literally have a bill passed by the Republicans that would prevent a default that they can support at any moment. Now, realistically, they're going to negotiate. Some of the stuff is going to get pared back from this, and they'll hopefully reach a middle ground and avoid this. But Republicans have done their job. They've passed the bill. It's really on the Democrats, but they're just gaslighting, and the media coverage of this is very misleading. But look, it is sad that this is the best we can get from Republicans, but I will say it's a heck of a lot better than the alternative that Biden and company are presenting. But yep, keep an eye on that story. We'll have to move on for now to our quick hits segment.
Well, speaking of people who have absolutely no economic literacy, we have to play this TikToker from a out-and-out communist. And I want to play this because I increasingly realize that a lot of people truly don't understand what progressives actually believe. And I think he does a pretty good job of summing it up. So I want to play this video, and then I want us to counter it and help explain why this is completely idiotic.
Capitalism requires the existence of a class of people who only have their labor power to sell in exchange for basic human survival needs like food, water, and shelter. Capitalism is a system designed to deprive people of their basic human needs in order to exploit them in the workforce. This is all to the benefit of a small, privileged class of individuals who enjoy and own all the wealth, resources, and property. To put it simply, capitalism depends on the concept of wage labor. Throughout history, this relationship between capital and labor has been known popularly as wage slavery, for the very reason that the idea of entering into a wage contract where you are literally selling yourself, or rather renting yourself, into servitude is an abominable, fundamental assault on human rights.
So there's a lot there. But first, I think it's crazy to me, these woke people. Isn't it kind of racially insensitive to compare working for a wage that's voluntary, you have your choice of jobs, you choose, you accept, you sign the dotted line, to literal slavery, which was very much not voluntary. People were not compensated. They weren't able to walk away at any time. I mean, you'd think that would get them canceled by their own community. No, that kind of insensitive comparison.
It's historically bankrupt. The opposite of slavery is being paid for your labor. Those are the two opposites, right? It's actually the foil. So to compare it is ridiculous. It is highly offensive, and you would think that they would get canceled for it if anybody was actually kind of dissecting what they were saying. But I think what you have, and this is at root of communist progressivism, socialism, their ideologies, is this factor of greed and class envy, where these people are taught to hate people who are more successful than them. They're taught to hate people that they work for. They're taught that those are their enemies. That was always a vital component of spreading these ideologies if you read the writings of their creators, so that you have people who want to sort of have this greed and anger towards the ruling class that they'll come in and overthrow it. It's ridiculous because if in order to think like this man thinks, you would have to, one, be completely unaware of how societies functioned before capitalism, which mostly was either through slavery or feudalism or having to work for other people and not fully get to reap the rewards of that work. You weren't given a salary, you didn't get to keep the proceeds of your own labor, and you also didn't have the choice to go work for yourself. And that's a fundamental part of capitalism. Nobody's forcing you to take a salary or go work for somebody else. You have every bit as much liberty to start your own business or to work as an independent contractor, unless Biden and the unions get their say on that. But for the time being, you have those abilities as much as the next guy does. If you choose to not take that initiative, if you choose to not go and work that hard, if you choose not take the risk that is involved in opening your own business, then you can still go work for somebody else and you can negotiate your salary and you can figure out what you think is a fair price for the work that you have to provide. And if you want to make more money, you can go and acquire more skills and increase your value. These things were not opportunities that you saw under virtually any other system known to man until capitalism came along. So he just fundamentally misunderstands what was in existence before capitalism and what would exist if it were to go away.
Yeah, he does. I think a couple other points there. The idea that capitalism relies on people not having their needs met to keep them subservient or whatever. It's actually kind of the opposite in that capitalism, you get rich by serving other people's needs, right? The customer's always right. Amazon, Jeff Bezos, has made billions of dollars, but he did it by literally developing a company that brings extraordinarily affordable goods delivered the next day to your doorstep in a way that people couldn't have imagined a few decades ago. He did it by meeting people's needs in a better way than his competitors, not by depriving people of what they need to survive. That doesn't make any sense.
He acts like needs don't exist organically. Like you always have
starting point. Scarcity is the starting point.
There's scarcity, exactly. And to act like capitalism requires there to be need. No, capitalism acknowledges the fundamental reality that people have needs. And you have to have the mentality of a 5 or 6 year old to continue to be able to deny that very factor and to think that if it weren't for capitalism, all your needs would just be magically met. Yeah. By what? Benevolent dictators who just want to take care of you.
The idea that capitalism only benefits like a wealthy cabal at the top or whatever is just simply not true. I mean, think of the average poor person in America today is better off, has a higher material standard of living than the richest elites did 75 years ago. Not only
that. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, it's also been responsible for huge reductions in global poverty, maternal mortality, standards of living across the board, because capitalism relies on mutually beneficial trade and transactions, and everyone gets rich at the same time. Yes, the rich get really rich, but everybody's standard of living goes up.
Yes, and capitalism, is important to remember, has really only been in popularity since about 250 years ago. It just really started being implemented. But you can go to Human Progress, which is a great website for tracking some of this, and look at the data, look at the graphs as it has spread to different countries. Globally, it has reduced world poverty, world hunger, it has increased lifespans. You mentioned all those things, but it has done so in such a short period of time. It is actually mind-boggling. And you can even look. It's miraculous, yes. And you can even look as it has spread to third worlds, as it is increasingly spreading, you can watch them on the graph start to increase in these same ways. I think you have to be completely in a bubble to ignore just how amazing capitalism has been for humanity. There is nothing else that compares. And even when it has been tried imperfectly, like it has been in the US, we have still seen it lead to greater increases in wealth and an expansion of the quality of life at far higher rates than when you see communism or socialism tried. They'll often say these things have not been done perfectly. They haven't been implemented as we see them. Well, we've seen you do your best, and it's led to mass deaths and destitution and reduction in the quality of life and in lifespan. And the opposite is true for capitalism. So I think this is just such a really childish viewpoint of the world. And it is astounding to me the number of people who continue to ascribe to this ideology.
Hey guys, Brad here. I want to tell you about another podcast you might like since you're a fan of based politics. Undivided with Brandy Cruz, a Seattle-based podcast that looks to give a voice to Americans who can't stand either major political movement. The show is a mix of commentary on key issues and in-depth interviews that challenge mainstream narratives on topics like race, gender, and criminal justice. The host, Brandy Cruz, is a longtime TV journalist who quit corporate media out of frustration for how the press was covering political violence carried out by the left in 2020. Find out how you can watch or listen to Undivided by visiting undividedpod.com. That's undividedpod.com. A link will be in the show notes.
All right, up next, we've got an amazing speech from the gala held recently by the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, FIRE, which was keynoted by Killer Mike, who's a rapper who dabbles a little bit in politics, but is actually a Bernie Sanders supporter. But he made a really powerful and moving speech advocating for free speech. Take a listen to this first clip.
To suppress free speech is a double wrong. It violates the rights of the hearer and as well as those of the speaker. I'd always been taught free speech from a very selfish standpoint. I have the right to say whatever the I want to. But what I understood is that when I would ride the train to go to 5 Points to watch people debate religion or politics or something, that I wasn't going to speak. I was going to hear. And what I heard greatly affected me, and it helped me understand that oftentimes the person across the street from me, or the person across the table from me, or the person across from the idea that I think is right has something to offer if I'm willing to hear them.
So I love what he said here, because I think that what he's saying his mentality was towards free speech is one I often see on the right these days, where it's, you think you have the right to express yourself, but you don't necessarily believe other people have the right to express themselves or to not platform your views, which is part of free speech in itself. So I think that even on the side of the political aisle that is more open to free speech ideas, they're still imperfectly understood and held. And this is an important component of them. But not just that, but that it's also important to listen to people who you disagree with. And that's something I think we see more on the left, where they don't want to listen to people. They don't want to hear anything that counters their ideas. It's really interesting. We mentioned this podcast that you brought to my attention a few weeks ago, The Witch Trials of J.K. Rowling. And I thought it was a really well done podcast, really just super production and really detailed in its defense of free speech. I then listened to a counter YouTube yesterday by ContraPoints, who was actually featured on that podcast and didn't like how the show came out and was pushing back on it. And it was an interesting back and forth. And I've tweeted about both now. And I think it's important that people try to do that. Try to listen to people who disagree with you, right? I already really liked the podcast. I thought I probably wouldn't agree with ContraPoints and her, kind of takedown of it. But I still wanted to hear what she had to say to see if I was missing something. And I think that's what it really comes down to, is sort of an intellectual humility, a fear of like, what if I'm missing something? What if I'm wrong? What if they know something I don't? And instead we see a pervasive view in society that, everything you think is correct, everything that people you disagree with are incorrect, and that people are all good or all bad, things are black and white. And that's really just hardly ever how things actually go. There's a lot of nuance. And I wish more people could have that attitude. That's one thing we try to bring with Based Politics to our audience. It's funny. Sometimes I'll gain a ton of followers on like Instagram for a video that's a bit more red pilled, and then I'll get so much pushback when I put up something that's libertarian or something that agrees with Democrats on something, and people will say, know your audience. And I always say, no, know us. You're not going to get an echo chamber here. You're not going to get red meat just constantly thrown at you. I want people to be able to think and to know how to think and to know how to engage with ideas they disagree with, even in a healthy manner. And I love that he's out here saying this. I'm not familiar with this work, but bravo all around for this.
Yeah, there were a couple interesting things in his speech. He talks about how the fact that George Wallace, who was the segregationist governor of Alabama, actually saw the light at the end of his life and was convinced that racial segregation was wrong, and how redemption is so important, and how you reach people through debate and dialogue, and you don't just write people off. And I also loved his point about even the people who you strongly disagree with have something to offer you. right? And they have something to help you complete your understanding of an issue, make it more thorough. I saw, this reminds me of this tweet, like Robert Reich, who's a progressive lefty economist in air quotes, was tweeting about why he wants a wealth tax. And he says, the right claims that rich people can't afford it. And I'm like, no one on the right claims that, right? The arguments are about the incentives and the economics. No one's saying they can't afford it. That's not an argument. And it's like so many people don't actually understand the opposition's view. And if you don't understand it, you can't really argue against it. So that was one part I really appreciated. Take a listen to this second part.
You know the good guys. I'm a black activist. I'm working on the behalf of women. I'm doing this for immigrants, gays and lesbians alike. We've often allied. We've often helped each other. We've often fought the same masters for basic rights. But be warned that once you become in power, to use government as a bludgeon is as evil as the masters before you.
So I love what he says here about the activist realizing that once they're in power, not to just beat the other side or try to crush them into submission, because I really think that is what you see on the far left with the LGBT activists, with the feminists, with the racial justice advocates. They really do seem to want to swing the pendulum back in the opposite direction and ban hate speech or force them to bake the cake, or in all these ways emulate the illiberalism and censoriousness of the side that they rose originally in opposition to.
Mm-hmm. And you see it on the right in Florida, as we just detailed. I think that this is absolutely true. You have to stand for free speech when you're the one being oppressed, or when you're the one that has the power to oppress other people. And I think that that is something that is just not widely held in this country anymore. We really are losing that true, like, civil liberties defense. And that's not a country I want to live in. I think back in the day, you at least had Democrats and Republicans who could come together and agree on these fundamental issues, these fundamental things that we have protected and enshrined in the Bill of Rights, because they are so important to human flourishing. They are actual rights that you have as an individual and that need to be protected by government. And instead, we see people increasingly wanting to use the government to go after people who they disagree with on these fundamental liberties. And that's a really sad state of affairs. It's not good for society. As you mentioned with Robert Reich, they can't even express what their opposition actually thinks because they're not even listening to them. They're trying to deplatform people or cancel them or shut them down before they even truly know what they've had to say. And I've experienced this somewhat recently too, as I've become a little bit more known as like a, right wing, even though I don't consider myself that, commentator, where people will prejudge me or assume they know what I think about certain issues or ascribe certain things to me because of that being my profession. And I find it really unfair and also just sort of depressing, because I'm like, I have a whole body of work, a decade worth of work out here on many of these issues, and you're assuming that I'm the opposite of them. You're not even taking time to hear me or really flesh out what I have to think. And it's like this need to use your group think function to deal with people you don't like. You don't know how to actually counter ideas you disagree with. And so instead of dealing with those on an individual level and working through them, you put somebody in a class because of one idea they have and assume they hold a whole bunch of other ideas, and you just shut them down. And I really do think this is going to become a bigger and bigger problem in our society if we don't see people rededicate themselves to the basic principles of, like, I hate what you have to say, but I'll protect to the death your right to say it.
Yeah, and the group defending those principles is FIRE. They are the new ACLU, because the ACLU has gone woke. And is a lost cause. I mean, it still does some good work, but on free speech, they're a lost cause. So I thought it was an amazing speech, an amazing organization, and check out that full speech. It is on YouTube. All right, now let's move to our mailbag and see what you all had to say about last week's episode. First up, Sergeant Pickles says, I was suggested your podcast as a regular Brandy Cruz listener. We did a promo swap with Brandy, and I very much enjoy the few episodes I have listened to so far. Thank you both for calling out the corruption and hypocrisy from both sides. I hope we all can return more to center and have space for civil disagreements again. I love that.
I do love that. Welcome to the show. Aaron Best says, does Hannah think aliens aren't real, or if the UAP footage is not real, does she think there is no other life outside of Earth? Yeah, like I said, I've spent virtually zero time thinking about this because it's just not something that's really ever interested me. I've always said, like, if somebody's an atheist, I think it's really weird that they spend all this time trying to counter Christianity. Like, you just wouldn't care. And that's sort of how I feel about aliens. I've just never really believed in them. So I haven't really spent a lot of time trying to look into it or debunk it. I think my knee-jerk reaction is just, one, if there were, we'd have more proof of that, or they would have made contact or something. But two, I think furthermore, the reality is even if they are real, I just don't really care. Like, I'm just kind of not that interested. It doesn't captivate me at all.
This is your worst take. I disagree. I disavow. All right. Kurt says, by the way, Brad, thanks for debating Knowles. Thanks for debating Sam Cedar. You represent libertarian philosophy well. Please don't sell out to authoritarianism in 10 years when you're mega popular and have a huge audience. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Dennis Erb says, ban crooked line Schumer and the Line Communist News Network.
No, that's kind of the opposite of what the takeaway from our podcast was supposed to be. We're against banning media.
Yeah, period.
We don't want to ban the other side. We don't want to ban any of it. Radical concept.
Imagine that kind of consistency.
Tim Smith says, this was a great show. As usual, you guys hit the nail on the head. Thank you, Tim. That is what we try to do.
Mm-hmm. All right, let's move on to our hot takes. Brad, what do you have?
Okay, my hot take is this. If you take the time out of your day to write a note and leave it on somebody's dashboard, it's saying, park in the lines, that's a little bit Karen behavior. I'm just going to say that. That's a little bit Karen behavior. Did I park outside the lines? Yes. Am I guilty? Yes. Is it that big a deal, though, that you went and scrummaged around in your car for a piece of paper and a pen? You wrote out a note, went over to my car and put it in. It's like there's a whole parking lot. I'm sorry you couldn't get into that one space. There's plenty of other spots. Keep it moving, lady. I don't know. I am guilty as charged, but I think that's a little dramatic. If I saw somebody parked poorly and I couldn't get into a spot, I would roll my eyes and move on with my day. I wouldn't take out several minutes to write them a little letter about how upsetting it was to me.
I was about to ask, where would you even get a pen and paper? Who has a pen and paper these days? That's got to be an older person. I haven't even seen a pen and paper in
probably a
days.
Boomer.
It's got to be a boomer. That is funny that happened to you. One time I had it happen to me, but somebody literally had cards made that they carried around with them for this exact purpose. It was like a business card. I was like, this is a serial killer. Like, you need psychiatric help. Thank God. I could have been serial killed by this person. So anyways, yeah, totally crazy behavior. I think it's really weird. All right. My hot take is that people should reserve their judgments of your parenting for dogs as well as kids. I don't think it's anybody else's business how I raise my dog. I know some people get very sensitive about being told how to parent their kids. I feel that way about my dog. I'm working really hard with him. He's increasing every day in his good boyness, and I'm doing the best I can, but he is a 7-month-old puppy, and I am tired of people coming for me just because he maybe jumps a little bit too much or, is a little hyper at certain times. And I just think it's kind of offensive and it hurts my feelings, and I want people to stop.
All right, there you go. Remind me to never say it and give you any advice.
Never say a word against
also,
Phoenix.
I don't have anything to advise because my dog is literally completely spoiled.
I mean, so is mine, but honestly, he really is so good. It's just that he got so big so quickly. People forget he's 7 months old, so he's still very much a baby, and he's doing great for a 7-month-old dog, very calm, but people expect him to act like he's 10, and it's just not fair. And I'm not going to hear another word against
my boyfriend and I argue about which one of us does Reggie think is the alpha and which one of us does he think is the peer. But the truth is he definitely thinks he's the alpha because he kind of for example, I woke up at 6:50 this morning, which is 45 minutes earlier than I usually wake up because Reggie decided it was time for him to go out. So he jumps down from the bed and starts tapping at the door. And it's like, oh, guess I'm waking up now. And then when we're watching TV or something, if he's ready for his dinner, he just goes and stands right next to his bowl and looks at us. And it's like, oh, all right, guess I got to get up and feed you now. So
little socialist.
Yeah, he's in charge. Well, everyone's a communist with their own family. It just
That's
doesn't
exactly true.
It doesn't work when you apply it out to strangers.
That's a good point. Yeah, Phoenix does the same thing. He's so tall now. He just comes and kind of plops his head up on the bed and he's like, let's go. So he decides when we're getting up. But usually what I do is just let him out and then I go back to bed. That's kind of my little trick. All right, guys, that's a wrap. We hope you enjoyed the episode. As always, leave us a review, leave us a comment. We'll read it on air. And until next week, stay based.